Hello, welcome to another episode of Destination Big Leagues. In today's episode, I've got Sundar Narayanan. Sundar has got extensive experience of advising companies on AI ethics. He's got about 18 years of experience in total. Uh, Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. Really looking forward to having a super engaging conversation over the next 45 minutes to an hour. Thank you so much, Sundar. Just so the audience kind of knows your credentials, I would love to have you kind of run through, some of the extensive work that you've done within artificial intelligence ethical research.
Yeah, thanks, Ronak. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast and happy that we're able to connect today. I'm going to, I'll briefly explain what I do. So, if I need to classify what I do, I do independent research. Um, on topics relating to ethics, governance, risk management, with a focus on fairness and security. And that's exactly where my work is. Some of my work is got published in Europe's both in 2023 and also in 2022. Uh, my research subjects include AutoML tools, legal analysis, and also algorithmic issues that are in focus with reference to the topics that I spoke about. Then the second part is I do advisory. I advise companies in the West to address how they can implement their AI ethics and governance into their platforms. That's the second part that I do. I advise companies in Canada, US, and the UK on these topics. Then the third part is I work on with universities on education to help students learn about AI ethics. I also try and help create content in nature of doodles, memes, and podcasts to communicate the learnings relating to AI ethics. Then the fourth part is I work with local government, which is in India, for both Ministry of Telecommunication and also the standards body in trying to build the standards on AI ethics and governance. So that's the whole space of what I operate in. Hope that gives you a perspective.
Totally. That gives a good understanding of, your credentials and background. So kind of want to get into, the core of the discussion. So, a new emerging field based on, the advancements of artificial intelligence is responsible AI. And why has, like the ethical considerations of all these technologies reached a point where every organization is thinking about these implications?
If I have to respond to this question, we need to actually understand how do we operate, right? We as humans operate based on um, we act on things when there is an advantage or when there is a threat. We don't act on things otherwise. One of the basic incentives and motivations is when there is an advantage or in any manner, or a threat in any manner for our existence. So I think the way ethics and governance are getting more prominent at this point in time for artificial intelligence is primarily stemming from there. One is there are companies which are thinking that this could be a value addition and advantage for them to expand onto the market space, which are demanding trustworthy tools. On the other side, there are companies which are actually thinking that they need to protect themselves from regulatory compliance issues, liability issues that may come up because of unfair systems, insecure tools, or discriminatory outcomes, as the case may be. And that's how organizations are trying to evolve. There are also organizations which are essentially trying to be in the middle of both, which is they want to take advantage of the environment to bring more trustworthy systems, and also they wanted to ensure they are complied they are complying with regulations, and also able to manage potential liabilities that may come across, right? Those are the organizations which are working in trying to enforce standards, adopt standards, and also try and help work with governmental organizations in shaping up the space of standards and regulatory policy itself. So this is how I'll actually describe uh, the environment.
Right. So, when organizations are developing their, their AI, their generative AI use cases, at what stage of their, sort of journey of their AI life cycle should they start thinking about responsible AI considerations?
So I wrote a book chapter on how can one think about responsible AI as a business case itself. So I would always propose that organization think about it when they are actually putting together a business strategy itself, product strategy itself. That helps them try and see how they're able to weave in responsible AI as part of the process rather than being an afterthought. That's how I would see it. There are certain clear advantages of that approach, and they will be able to leverage it and market it.
Totally. So basically, weave it in part of the business strategy itself. Okay,
Yep.
so one of the biggest challenges with the current state of artificial intelligence and with the the surge of generative AI is a lot of these systems are sort of undeterministic. They're black box systems. It's really difficult to kind of predict the outcomes. You can probabilistically estimate to what the desired outcome is going to be, but however, it's really hard to really predict on a deterministic basis of the behavior of these models. So from I guess from a responsible AI uh, uh, lens, how do you govern these algorithms to make sure they're not encroaching out of the responsible AI ethics and guidelines?
Yeah, this is thanks for this question. This is a very pertinent and important question at this point in time. Let's take it step by step. The first part that we need to actually look at it is there are organizations, they need to ensure that the systems do not go beyond the slated policies or guidelines for responsible AI. But the fundamental for it is that these are not deterministic systems. These are probabilistic systems, right? The theory of probability automatically refers that the probabilities the probabilities are going to be the ones which will determine the set of actions, and you cannot always predict the probability appropriately at all times. That's the same challenge that we have in the whole space of AI and ML. It's not very different, but the thing is the scale at which that we are dealing with the problem is very significant. So it is not the only way. In terms of probability, how will we deal with it? We will deal with it with domain understanding, informed kind of stakeholders, and a way to read and interpret content or outcomes in an appropriate way. These are the three things that we will look at currently, because the AI is trying to democratize the use of the technology. You do not have domain expertise in that, because the general public may not necessarily have domain expertise. You not necessarily the tools are able to provide sufficient level of interpretability so that the users of the tool have sufficient informed decision. And the third is that it is not able to provide a level of reflection that the user is able to have clear approaches of how to interpret the outcome and how to interpret the model behavior. Now, these three things are the root causes that contributes to the larger problem of responsible AI issues, right? So, how do we bring in this in the process? First is how to make the tool interpretable. Second, how to communicate with the user, where you're able to communicate what kind of limitations the tool has, and alert the user when the limitations are crossed, and also take feedback from the user on where there are adverse incidents. Third, provide a clear guidance on when it requires domain awareness and domain involvement, domain expertise, for them to understand the outcomes of the tool and not just rely on the outcomes that are thrown. By just starting with these, it's a good start to try and contribute to responsible AI progress.
Totally, I totally agree. So, as part of my daytime job, recently I've been working on a white paper on responsible AI, and one of the kind of working hypotheses that we've developed is that, uh, you know, responsible AI guidelines and frameworks really need to be sort of sculpted based on the AI use case. So, let's take, for example, like fairness and transparency, like based on different use cases. I think they mean different differences. They have different meanings essentially. So how do you view that? Do you think responsible AI sort of core principle definitions change based on AI use cases?
Again, another very important question, but I'm going to answer it in a very a little twisted way, but you will get the essence of what I'm trying to say. So if we actually look at all the available ML applications and AI applications, right? I'm just differentiating them. In a typical ML environment, all that you're trying to do is at a use case level, right? And in the AI environment, all that you're trying to do is at an upstream level, not at the use case level, but where you're setting up a foundation model, the foundation model or a pre-trained model that you're trying to establish there. Now, what happens is there are two stages. One is the kind of guardrails that you need to have at overall foundation model level, and the second is the kind of guardrails that is required for the downstream uses, right? The upstream uses and the downstream uses. The upstream is what is widely spoken about and discussed. Even the benchmarks and thresholds that are actually shared consistently are all speaking about the upstream one, not about the downstream one. The downstream is more complex. For example, as of today, if you actually look at retrieval augmented generation kind of benchmarks, you will see that most of the models are in the range of about 74 to 78 percentage in terms of benchmarking, right? They are not exceptional beyond that, right? But when you actually apply the same thing in a domain context, you realize that they could even be 40 percentage or 45 percentage big and may throw out several set of issues. Now that is very important to understand. If you there are I'm going to be counterintuitive in providing two three examples to explain my point of view, right? Example number one is, if you actually look at a scenario like the upstream has absolute kind of filters for inappropriate content, and your downstream use of that language model. Let's take for this example, we are speaking about a language model. The upstream has a lot of filters on the kind of words that you can use, and the downstream is having is about conversations with um, rape victims, and trying to provide them comfort while they're trying to get out of the trauma. At that point in time, if it starts filtering out those keywords as abusive keywords, then there is a bigger impact. The cause is getting lost. This is one stream that I wanted to say, where the purpose and cause is very different from what is your upstream and what's your downstream. Second is a kind of terminology or an approach that you adopt in upstream, and the kind of terminology and an approach that you approach in a downstream are very different. So there are certain terminologies, words, uses, abbreviations which have a different kind of context between your upstream and downstream, and sometimes what is less riskier in upstream is more riskier in a downstream environment. So you may need to look at them very specifically. So the risk related to downstream needs to be looked at in context. So that's the second thing that I will say. Then the third is that when you're looking at upstream, upstream cannot always get an assessment of all possible issues. It will only look at all primary issues, right? You can never look at it from a all possible issues perspective, but in a domain context, in a specific downstream use case, you will be able to contain all the walls and then try and test it. This is something that we have done 100,000 times in security, right? In security we don't do an upstream testing, We do it in a downstream testing environment where you have a closed loop environment and then you test it in that environment and then see what fails, right? That's the same thing that works because of these three reasons, where one, the purpose and context may vary. Second is the relevance of the context may vary, and the third is ability to validate and then understand the risks may vary, and hence there needs to be a very specific understanding of how to deal with the same responsible AI principles in the domain context or use case environment. And you won't see a lot of benchmarks in that particular space. I think in the next 10 years I expect that to be the next level of progress in responsible AI.
Right. I totally agree.
Sorry, that was
So,
very
no,
elaborate, but
no,
I
that
hope
makes
this
sense.
clarifies.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. So, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about fairness, right? Fairness, like the more you dig deep into it, is a really philosophical word, right? Two people might have two different interpretations of what is fair. Oftentimes, So, when building sort of responsible AI use case, sort of artificial intelligence. AI use cases and trying to adhere to responsible AI principles. Like, how is one supposed to define all of these sort of, in a way, philosophical definitions like fairness, right? So, for example, what I often believe is that at one point you have to sort of impose your own personal ethics to the products and systems that you're developing, right? So, how is one supposed to kind of build these definitions on a framework basis?
It's very complicated. It is not easy at all, and I wouldn't recommend somebody trying to push their personal ethics into the product, because it has its own side effects. Right? We are all a bunch of biased idiots, if we need to say. That's our human evolution. So that's how you will see us. So the if organization needs to deal with bias, right, their approach should be, whom am I catering to? It's the same approach they take for product market fit that they need to apply it here. Who is my product audience? Who's my target audience? And how am I looking at product market fit for them? And I want to just replicate the same thing and then say, what is the possibility that I am biased against certain groups within this product market category? And for those groups, what do I need to do? There are times where you will be able to address the bias to a certain extent. Second is you will be able to limit the bias. Address this after it happens, limit is before it happens. And third is you are able to inform the customer on how they need to treat this, right? So that way you're trying to create a lesser impact because of that bias. Now, there are several techniques and approaches associated with it. None of those will be foolproof. And I don't believe we as humans would solve bias as a problem in machine learning in the next decade. It will remain as a problem. It will amplify the level of problems. We will solve certain buckets of the problems. We will keep open certain other buckets of the problem. Let me give you one example which is not spoken at all significantly. Um, if you go to any of the chat models and then actually search saying that you um, just explain this mathematics equation to a person with disability, it will say mathematical equations are very complex to understand for persons with disability, right? But you coming from computer science and math background, you are able to relate to it that mathematical equations doesn't have anything to do with person with disability. Person without disability also goes through the same kind of rut that a person with disability will go through to understand it, right? So there's nothing different in that. So that's the kind of essence that is already embedded into social structures and these models, and that has a significant impact. And majoritarian view will always have an influence. And the current way models are getting developed, foundation models are getting trained, they are trained on content from the internet, which will always propose a majoritarian view. more you have majoritarian view, there's going to be bias against minority view, and that will continue to happen.
I think Right. And I think that, I think bias is just something that's just inherent. I think a system that's not biased is totally utopian. Like, I just such a noble or novel thought. Like, I just feel like it's never going to work in conception, as a philosophical thought of like a unbiased system. It is cool to ponder upon it, but I think in reality, it's just not possible. And you clearly illustrated like maybe some of the problems are going to be solved, some of the buckets are going to be solved, but what happens is when you try to solve some buckets, other buckets arise. So it's kind of like that seesaw situation. The more you solve for this side, the more problems arise on the other side, and then you try to fix this side, the problems arise that side.
It's like people trying to empty the sea by taking buckets of water from out of it, right? They will never empty it. They'll just keep finding it, right? So there's a point that you mentioned about, right, bias is a utopian thing. I want to give a mathematical construct to it. Bottom line is, if there is no bias, there is no machine learning, because essentially machine learning is probabilistic systems, right? If we're going to base it on probability is going to have bias, and that's the basic fundamental, right? So every model, everything on earth is going to have bias. What we're actually speaking about is it leading to unfairness or not, right? And that's where the whole trouble is. People's definitions and confusions come from this whole concept that they know what bias is, they don't know what unfairness is, and they think bias is equal to unfairness, or fairness is equal to bias, and confuse the whole scope. So the way I think is that the best way to address it, again in the use case environment, is to see who are you catering to, and how do you validate the group or the customer population that you're actually looking at, or the stakeholder population that you're looking at, and see how they're affected by it, and what's the possibility that they will be biased, or they will have discriminatory results out of the machine.
Right. At least the awareness that, at certain points the system fails. So being aware of that inherent bias can also serve a long ways, as like pretending that it's a perfect system. But I want to sort of delve into this thing, right? You talked about the product market fit, understand who your product is serving towards. That is fine when it's, a niche AI tool or product which is used by by a group of users that you can bucket, right? But let's talk about like Gemini and Anthropic and Chat GPT and stuff like that. These are general purpose tools served for a wide cohort of audience, right?
You
Like
cannot solve the problem. You cannot solve the problem, right? So because again, I come back, sorry to interrupt, but you'll get the point that I'm getting to. These are all upstream, right? You cannot solve certain problems upstream because they are not contained within a perimeter. When you have a downstream use case which is contained within a perimeter, the possibility of you addressing the problem is very high. And that's the example that I gave when you were speaking about why you need to have use case specific risk environment.
Totally. Okay. So let me try to, run this simulation just to see how your thinking is, right? So we know like Gemini recently had this whole fiasco of their Vogue AI. Their systems were generating, like if you spoke about who was the founding father of America, generate an image, it would show like indigenous people, right? Like it wouldn't show the true people. It was just, it seemed like it was a model that was completely overfitted to fit the scope of diversity and all of those aspects, right? If you were the chief ethics officer for uh, Google, how would you handle that situation?
Thankfully, I'm not. But said that, what I would actually look at it is like this, right? Um, it should not mimic an unbiased view. It should mimic a relative biased view. And the relativistic yardstick is what it is, right? None of us are unbiased. As humans, we are not unbiased. And hence, the model needs to understand the context and then accordingly resonate it. Now, there are two factors in the Gemini fiasco. One is corrupting the facts, or the where the representation of facts is mishandled. Second is the way it was biased in terms of general outcome itself, right? And when I say general outcome biased, that also had issues in terms of, okay, you ask about black couple, it will show you up. You ask about white couple photograph, it will not show up, because it thinks that it is against that. Now these are um, the second part is completely caused by the safeguards, guardrails that are put in. What kind of guardrails have you implemented? How efficient are these guardrails? Should you have these guardrails in a manner that it is influencing somebody's um, decision in a very discriminatory way, positively or negatively? Right? Discrimination does not always mean a discrimination against a minority. Discrimination can also be against majority. The point is the focus of discrimination. So that's the part. So it's a safeguards and guardrails problem, where too much of guardrail swinging towards something that considered to be pro um, right, in that sense, will always create in confusions, right? So that's a side of a problem where which can be easily addressed at a concept level, and requires risk mitigation approaches at a downstream use level, not at upstream use level. At a concept level, you know what are the things that you can do to address it. On the other side, the first part of the problem is about how it represents facts. That's a very dangerous proposition. At this point in time, I keep saying this, we are in the space of high level information pollution. Everything that we see here, speak about, consume, everything is polluted information. We have no clue of understanding what is the fact. Earlier were the days where we relied on newspapers, research papers, or relied on books. None of those are reliable sources at this point in time, because they rely on social media for their insights, or they rely on generative AI for their insights. So that becomes very, very unreliable. The biggest problem humans are going to face is not extinction because of AI, but clearly um, a crisis because of information pollution. And this will affect every industry, every department, every function, every stream, resulting in um, a lot of waste of efforts in the future. Because you don't know facts, you will end up doing experiments which are not facts and result in failures, etc., etc., etc. So you're going to go through a lot of this process. Information pollution is the biggest challenge, and for that, even if I was the chief executive of Google, I could not have done anything. The only thing that I could have done is not to push these models before sufficient testing and evaluation, and that's the only thing that I could have done.
Right. So, like that you mentioned testing and evaluation, right? I feel like a lot of the evaluation and testing metrics are often single dimensional. They test across like a single benchmark, and then often, you know, is not helpful in portraying the reality of the performance of these models, right? Like oftentimes when you look at papers for GPT-4, they compare it to the bar exam or the SAT exam. These are all just single dimensional metrics. So how do you think that the state of testing and evaluation is to evolve in order for us to truly test these models as we progress into an AI first society?
We are literally screwed up in that particular space, because we don't have sufficient metrics. So let me tell you about it. Since 2012 and 2013, there have been discussions about fairness. 2015 onwards, there's been heavy discussion about fairness in the context of AI. Now we are in 2024, right? If you actually look at it, you don't have sufficient fairness metrics that are reliable in multiple circumstances, and you have challenges with it. There are there are tabular metrics for tabular data. Um, Some of those metrics are contested, and very contextual, you cannot use them always, right? If you actually look at text related metrics, wheat seed score and all that, these wheat or seed scores, there are a number of papers which contest them to say that these are not most useful in detecting the bias in it. And if you look at audio, video, or image, you lack adequate metrics itself at the baseline. There are some metrics that are available, you lack adequate metrics. So I'm currently doing a project in compiling all these metrics together and trying to get inputs from multiple stakeholders to understand which of these metrics are useful. Of course, this is you can also access it. This is available on OECD list of tools. It's called as Bias Metrics Project. It has a library of all the metrics that are available there. The problem that I'm actually trying to speak about is that if we do not have sufficient detail of metrics, we're going to have a serious challenge in in our approach towards testing and evaluation. Right, testing and evaluation has three parts. One is test methods, second is test benchmarks, third is test data sets. The methods are things that needs to improve. We are trying to, with more and more standards coming in will contribute to that, right? But standards are going to rely on the metrics, right? We need to have more appropriate metrics for us to be able to do that, which means we need more specific and customizable metric which are not unidimensional, which are not limited to a particular dimension, so that we are able to develop benchmarks which are more useful from a downstream use and not just a upstream use case. This is the example that I gave. RAG scores at overall level, if it is 74 percentage, what does it mean when I apply it to a legal domain? The whole impact could be completely different, right? I can't rely on that metric. That benchmark is useless for me, right? So that's where the problem comes in. That's the second part. And the third part is more about once you have methods and metrics, then you're trying to develop a kind of approach to have how you can have data sets that are valuable, right? Now these data sets are going to be very important. The kind of test that you perform, how you compile the data set, how you use the data set to test it. When I say data set, it can be prompts as a data set. It could be a validation set as a data set, as the case may be. And this will differ for different domains. So you will not just test for whether it is working fine, but you will test for what are the possibilities or if it failing. So you will have a large database of failure modes of that kind of model. Let's say if you're speaking about neural network, CNN in specific, what are the 100 failure modes for CNN? And for each of those failure modes, do I have a validation set or a data for it so that I can validate whether that failure mode is impacting me or not? That open issue is impacting me or not? And that's where we need to go. Um, I think it's going to be a slow process. In the next 10 years, we'll get there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it just seems like there's so many, like, while we've opened this new gate of opportunity, we've unraveled a whole set of new problems as well. And they seem harder than ever to solve. Uh, okay. So,
Yeah, I look at it from a perspective that it's going to provide a lot of job opportunities. So in future, what people getting into the space need to look at is how are they able to fill the gap than trying to overcrowd in the places of power. So that's the difference.
right. So, okay. Moving into the interesting part, I think this is what people want to listen to. The state of regulations. Uh, who do you think is doing it right? Or, uh, if you were to look at any of the countries, are any of them doing it right?
See, regulations. So, sorry, I'm going to bring in some kind of philosophical bent in this, right? So, we as Homo sapiens evolved because others failed, right? So, it's not just about survival of the fittest, it is non survival of the fittest, which will also affect us, right? So you need not compete and succeed. So what we're actually speaking about is which is fittest, which will survive, right? Both fitness and survival depend on commercial organizations adopting regulations, right? Any regulation, if you're able to make commercial organizations adopt, it will work. When will commercial organizations adopt? When there is a strict rule of law and enforcement, when there is demand from their investors, when there is serious public scrutiny. There are only three ways in which commercial organizations will adopt regulations. If you are only relying on enforcement mechanism, then it is too tough to survive this whole wave. It won't be fit. It won't be survival mode, right? So we need to have all these three. The first one is regulations, right? The second one is more about investors or people who are investing money or spending money on businesses, and the stakeholders, they should be aware how responsible AI is a valuable proposition for them. And third, there should be public transparency reporting obligations, which is not necessarily regulatory, but these are obligations that should be more like climate change crisis reporting obligations that many companies are currently doing. If we don't adopt these, it may be very difficult to recover from these. Is the point of view that I want to share.
Right. So, I guess, like, what are your, views on the EU AI Act, the risk-based approach? Do you think that, that's a good way of going about it? And I guess the follow-up question would be is, like, if you were in charge of, creating a global policy or a global guideline or regulation on how AI should be enforced, uh, how would you set up that context from a point where you're letting innovators innovate but being cautious of the ramifications of their innovation?
I'll answer the second question first. I don't know. I have no clue. I have no clue how to make this happen. Right. So it's easy to be critic, right? I'm just one other critic trying to evaluate what happens and trying to pick up what is good in many of these, right? But to make it happen, it has a lot of political will. It has a lot of courage and influence that is required to do it. I don't think personally I will be in a position to influence something like that for sure, right? But coming back to this, but there is a nuance that I can actually address there, which is like the more you engage with customers, the more you will know how much your product is impacting. If you know how much your product is impacting your customers, you will work on it because that's why you're in business, right? So the thing is how to make it reasonably fair, how to test and evaluate your AI system for things like security, safety, privacy, right? And accountability, right? Transparency. Be make it very clear, and also causality. Have validation, have mechanism where the users can provide you feedback, have mechanism to notify the users on potential issues and potential threats in using them, in using some of the tools, some of the features, when they are using it. And this need not be negative, right? When they're using something, there's a possibility that it may have throw up negative results or inconsistent results. You need to mention to them this is more like a threshold, uncertainty threshold that you're actually providing it to them for them to consider. That's a way that you can resolve this. Coming to EUA Act, EUA Act is so the concept of risk-based approach is the most convenient and universally applicable approach at this point in time, because you're speaking about risk as a universal language, it becomes easier for you to combine everything into a risk-based approach, and that's useful, and that's what is driving a lot of changes. And I believe that's going to be a very important trump card, because when you convert everything into risk, you are easily trying to harmonize ac- the regulations across geographies because they are all based on one concept. It doesn't mean that it'll get easily harmonized because there are other challenges in terms of definitions of risk itself and definitions of approaches, definitions of issues, definitions of jurisdictions and their implications. And all of those definitions are going to be additional layers of challenges that we need to go through. But that's a very good starting point where you have something which is completely baseline. This is not the same for other kind of regulations. Even if you look at privacy regulations, not all the privacy regulations are consumer centric. Sometimes it is consumer centric. If you speak about US, sometimes it's more wellness and citizen protection initiative, which may not be consumers. Sometimes it's more about data protection from a national borders, national state, nation state perspective than anything else. Now, these are very different meanings of regulations, right? Sometimes it's rights based issues, rights based approach. Now, rights based approach, consumer centric approach, and safety needs are all very different dimensions, and we struggle with harmonization in that. While concepts may appear similar, because the foundations are not similar, it creates a lot of challenges. That's not the case in terms of this approach that we are actually speaking about, risk based approach, and that's a good advantage for us to pursue.
Right. Super interesting. Okay. So, to my final question, uh, what is your hope for humanity as we progress over the next decade or two?
I'm very hopeful because essentially we have we've survived 500,000 years, so we will survive. It's not. It's. I don't believe AI to be a threat for human existence, and at the same time, I don't believe AI is going to be a nice goodie. No. So what I'm trying to say is, it's going to be a wave. Humans react only in two circumstances: either to take advantage of it or to fight against a threat. We will see both waves rising, and we are seeing it already. We'll see both waves rising over the next decade or so, and we'll see different set of problems that we'll face with probably less intelligent and more intelligent kind of environments. But the gap that we're going to have in future is not going to be information gap or finance gap. It's going to be gap of powers. So the kind of challenges that we faced earlier was lack of resources first, then lack of information, lack of finances. The next thing that we're going to look at is lack of power. Power was always around nation state borders kind of a thing. Now it's going to be power between individuals, and that's going to be more um, yeah, harmful for us. We need to see how we deal with it, but I'm sure we will evolve.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sundar. Super insightful. Got to learn a lot. Hopefully, the audience enjoyed it. I'm going to link your LinkedIn down. You have a podcast. You share a lot of memes and sketches to convey concepts of AI governance and ethics and stuff. So, I definitely recommend people to check out his LinkedIn page. Anything else where people can find you and read and learn more about you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best place.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sundar.